Moscow, November 1949. A man sat down at a table and voted to arrest his own wife. He did not hesitate. There is no record of hesitation. There is no account in the documents that survived of a pause before the pen moved, or a question asked, or a moment in which the man sitting at the table gave any visible indication that the name on the document in front of him was the name of the woman he had been married to for 33 years. The vote was cast. The document was signed. The meeting continued. Her name was Polina Zhemchuzhina. She was 50 years old, a senior official in the Soviet government, a member of the Communist Party since 1918, a woman who had spent her entire adult life inside the machinery of the state that was now, with her husband's signature on the relevant paperwork, consuming her. His name was Vyacheslav Molotov. He was the foreign minister of the Soviet Union, the second most powerful man in the country, the man whose name appeared alongside Joachim von Ribbentrop's on the non-aggression pact that had divided Eastern Europe between Germany and the Soviet Union in 1939, and whose name as a result had entered history as a compound noun, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, in the specific way that history sometimes reduces a man to the document that most completely expresses what he was willing to do. He had signed his wife's arrest warrant and gone home. This is the story of what it costs a man to serve a tyrant. Absolutely. It is not a simple story about fear, though fear is present throughout. It is not a simple story about love, though love is present throughout, in the specific form that love takes when it has been subordinated to something larger than itself, for so long that neither the man nor the woman can entirely remember what it looked like before the subordination began. It is a story about the particular mechanism by which absolute power produces absolute compliance, about what a system does to the people inside it when it has been running long enough that the system's requirements and the person's own moral architecture have become indistinguishable from each other. Molotov signed the warrant. He voted to arrest his wife. He continued serving Stalin faithfully for 4 more years. And when Stalin died, and Polina was released from the labor camp where she had been held, Molotov wept. He wept when she came back. These are the facts. They exist in the same historical record, separated by 4 years. And the question they produce, the question that this account will not resolve, because it cannot be resolved, because no one who was in those rooms is alive to answer it, is what a man is exactly, who contains both of those moments inside him. But before Molotov, there is Stalin, and before the warrant, there is the marriage, and before the marriage, there is the woman who understood, before almost anyone else in Russia did, what kind of man she had chosen to love, and chose to love him anyway, and died in part because of what she understood. Her name was Nadezhda Alliluyeva. She was 16 years old when she met Stalin, and he was 38. And the disproportion in age was the least significant of the many disparities between them. He was already a senior Bolshevik operative, a man who had survived Tsarist prisons and Siberian exile and the underground years of revolutionary organizing, and had emerged from all of it with a particular quality of hardness that was distinguishable from strength only in retrospect, when the hardness had been applied to things that revealed its nature. She was the daughter of a Bolshevik family who had housed and sheltered him during the revolutionary period. She had grown up inside the movement, which meant she had grown up inside a specific moral world, a world in which personal loyalty was subordinated to the historical project, in which the individual's feelings were understood as materially less significant than the collective's direction, in which the language of sacrifice was not a metaphor but an operational instruction. She married him in 1919 when she was 18. She bore him 2 children, Vasily and Svetlana. She worked, she studied. She enrolled at the Industrial Academy in Moscow in the late 1920s to study synthetic fibers because she wanted a professional identity that was hers rather than his, a competence that did not derive from proximity to power. She was not a woman who was content to be adjacent to the historical record. She wanted to be inside it on her own terms. The Industrial Academy is where she encountered the first concrete evidence of what her husband was doing to the country. Her fellow students were not the children of party officials. They were the children of ordinary Soviet families, and in the late 1920s and early 1930s, ordinary Soviet families were being subjected to collectivization, the forced reorganization of agricultural production that Stalin had determined was necessary for the industrialization of the Soviet Union, and that was, in the specific form it took in Ukraine and the Soviet countryside, a policy of extraction so brutal that it produced a famine of deliberate proportions. Peasants who resisted surrendering their grain were classified as kulaks, class enemies, and deported or shot. Villages that failed to meet quotas had their remaining food confiscated. The famine that resulted killed, by conservative estimates, somewhere between 5 and 7 million people. Some estimates are higher. Nadezhda heard about this from the people around her at the academy. She heard specific accounts, names, villages, methods, that the official press was not reporting, and that the official reality of Stalinist governance was actively suppressing. She was a woman of genuine intelligence and genuine moral seriousness, and she could not hear these accounts and file them as irrelevant. She could not perform the specific cognitive operation that the system required of its participants, the operation of knowing and not knowing simultaneously, of registering information and immediately reclassifying it as something that did not require a response. She brought it to Stalin, the accounts of their relationship in these years, from Svetlana's memoirs, from the recollections of people who knew them, from the historical reconstruction that scholars have assembled from partial and incomplete sources, describe a marriage that had moved, by the early 1930s, into a state of sustained tension. He was cold, frequently absent, consumed by the machinery of power in ways that left little room for the ordinary transactions of domestic life. She was unhappy in the specific way that an intelligent woman is unhappy when the world she is living in does not match the world she was told she was helping to build. She had believed in the revolution. She still believed in it, but the revolution, in the form it was taking under the man she had married, was producing outcomes that strained the belief. She confronted him, not publicly, not in the way that would produce a historical record with dates and witnesses, but in the private space of their marriage, in the arguments that their household staff described in fragments and that Svetlana reconstructed in her memoirs with the imprecision of a daughter working from memory and grief. She asked him about the famine. She asked him about the collectivization. She asked him, in whatever form the asking took, between two people who have been married for 13 years and who have arrived at the specific exhaustion of a relationship that can no longer absorb the distance between what was promised and what is, to account for what was happening. He did not account for it in any way she could accept. The night of November 7th, 1932, the 15th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, there was a dinner at the Vyacheslav apartment in the Kremlin. It was a party occasion, the kind of gathering that the senior leadership held to mark the calendar of the state. Stalin was there. Nadezhda was there. The accounts of what happened at the dinner vary in their specifics, but converge on the essential shape. There was a public exchange between them, something Stalin said to her across the table, crude, dismissive, the specific contempt of a man who has stopped performing domestic courtesy, and she left the dinner. She went back to their apartment in the Kremlin. She wrote several letters, addressed to different people, including Stalin himself. The contents of these letters have never been fully disclosed, though Svetlana describes having read one of them and found it both personal and political, both the letter of a wife to a husband and the letter of a citizen to a leader, containing within it the specific mixture of private grief and public objection that had characterized the last years of the marriage. She was found dead the following morning. She had shot herself. The pistol, a small Walter that her brother Pavel had given her as a gift, which itself contains a kind of dark irony that the historical record does not need to annotate, was beside her. She was 31 years old. Stalin was told by his housekeeper. The accounts of his response describe a man who sat for a long time without speaking, who then stood and said that she had left him as an enemy. That was the phrase reported by multiple witnesses. In slightly different forms, she left me as an enemy, not she is dead. and I am devastated. Not the language of grief, the language of political categorization applied to the body of his wife on the morning after she died, before the funeral arrangements had been made. He did not attend her funeral. He went to the open casket in the Hall of Columns, looked at her, and walked away. He did not stand at the graveside. He was seen by witnesses to push the coffin away with his hand at the lying in state, a gesture that has been interpreted in various ways and that admits of no comfortable interpretation. Svetlana, who was 6 years old when her mother died, spent her life trying to understand what her mother had known and what it had cost her. She left the Soviet Union in 1967 and wrote about her family with the specific courage of a woman who had decided that the truth of her own history was worth the consequences of stating it. She died in 2011 in Wisconsin, having outlived the Soviet Union itself. Stalin lived for 20 more years after Nadezhda's death. He never remarried. He governed in those 20 years with an escalating paranoia that his daughter and his biographers have connected, in various ways, to the death, to the specific experience of a man who had been indicted by the person closest to him, whose accusation he could not answer and would not process, and who had therefore converted the indictment into something he could manage, evidence of betrayal, confirmation of the general thesis that the people around him could not be trusted, the opening proposition of the purges that would follow in the years after 1934 and consume the party, the military, the intelligentsia, and eventually a significant portion of the population. She wrote him a letter on the night she died. He could not answer the letter. He answered it at scale instead. But Nadezhda Alliluyeva is not the only woman in this account. She is the first, and her death is the originating event, the personal catastrophe that precedes and perhaps partially generates the political catastrophes that follow. The second woman is the one whose story begins this account. Polina Zhemchuzhina, the wife of the man who voted to arrest her. To understand the arrest, you have to understand Polina. She was born Pearl Karpovskaya in 1897 in a small town in what is now Ukraine, into a Jewish family of modest means. She joined the Bolshevik Party as a young woman, changed her name, made her way into the Soviet administrative apparatus through the specific combination of intelligence and political commitment that the early Soviet state occasionally rewarded with actual opportunity, and became by the mid-1930s a genuine figure in her own right, head of the Soviet perfume and cosmetics industry, then a deputy commissar for the food industry, then a commissar for the fishing industry. She held real authority. She exercised it. She was not Molotov's appendage. She was also, which would matter enormously in the specific political atmosphere of the late 1940s, Jewish. Her friendship with Golda Meir, who arrived in Moscow in 1948 as Israel's first ambassador to the Soviet Union, shortly after Israel's declaration of independence, was the proximate cause of her arrest, though the causality is more complex than the word proximate implies. When Golda Meir appeared at the Moscow synagogue on Rosh Hashanah in September 1948, she was surrounded by tens of thousands of Soviet Jews who had come to see her, who wept at the sight of her, who called out to her in Hebrew and Yiddish with a fervor that alarmed the Soviet authorities, because it was precisely the kind of allegiance to something other than the Soviet state, to an identity that preceded and exceeded Soviet citizenship, that the Soviet state under Stalin found existential. Polina was there. She spoke to Golda Meir in Yiddish. She told her, and this exchange was documented and reached Stalin, that she was Jewish and that she wished Israel well. In the specific atmosphere of late Stalinist anti-Semitism, in which the Soviet campaign against so-called rootless cosmopolitans was building toward what would eventually become the Doctor's plot, a senior Soviet official expressing solidarity with the Israeli ambassador in Yiddish was not a small thing. It was, depending on how it was read, either a private expression of ethnic feeling or evidence of the kind of dual loyalty that the paranoid architecture of Stalinist governance defined as treason. It was read the second way. The Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, a wartime organization created to mobilize international Jewish support for the Soviet war effort, which had served its purpose and by 1948 had become, in Stalin's assessment, a liability, was dissolved and its leadership arrested. Several of its members were executed. The campaign against Jewish cultural institutions and intellectuals intensified. And in this atmosphere, Polina Zhemchuzhina, wife of the second most powerful man in the Soviet Union, with documented contact with the Israeli ambassador, with a Jewish background that she had not concealed and in the current climate could not explain away, became a target. Molotov knew she was going to be arrested. He knew because the system he served gave certain men advanced knowledge of its intentions, and he was senior enough to be one of those men. He knew, and the question that the historical record asks and cannot fully answer is what he did with that knowledge in the period between knowing and the meeting where he voted. What is documented is that he abstained. Initially, in an earlier Politburo discussion about her case, he abstained rather than voting for her expulsion from the party. Stalin called him into his office. The content of that conversation is not in the historical record, but its outcome is. The next time the vote was called, Molotov voted yes. He voted yes. He expelled her from the party. He signed the paperwork that authorized her arrest. She was taken to Lubyanka for interrogation. She was then sentenced, without trial, in any meaningful sense, to 5 years in a labor camp in Kazakhstan, far from Moscow, far from the life she had built and the position she had held, and the husband who had put his name to the document that sent her there. What the interrogators wanted from her was a confession that implicated Molotov, that established him as part of whatever conspiracy she was being accused of participating in. She did not provide this. Whatever the conditions of the interrogation were, and the conditions of Lubyanka interrogations in the Stalinist period are documented in enough testimony to require no elaboration here. She did not give them Molotov. She protected him. The woman in the labor camp protected the man who had signed the paper that put her there. Molotov continued to serve Stalin. He continued to attend meetings, to conduct foreign policy, to appear at the Politburo sessions and the state dinners and the gatherings of the Soviet leadership, as if the woman in Kazakhstan were not a variable in his calculations. He wrote to her, in the labor camp, in letters that the archive has preserved, letters that historians who have read them describe as expressions of genuine love, of concern, of a man maintaining connection to a person he is not permitted to retrieve. He wrote to her, and he served the man who had put her there. He did both of these things simultaneously for 4 years, and the coexistence is the thing that the historical record cannot explain, and this account will not pretend to explain, because any explanation would require access to the interior of a man that no one has ever had. Stalin died on March 5th, 1953. He died on the floor of his dacha at Kuntsevo, having lain there for hours before anyone was willing to open the door in the manner described in other accounts of the period. He died, and within days the political architecture began to shift, cautiously, carefully, with the specific tentativeness of men who had spent years inside a system that punished independent judgment and were now required to exercise it. Polina Zhemchuzhina was released from the labor camp in March 1953, within weeks of Stalin's death. She was brought back to Moscow. She was driven to the apartment where Molotov was living. He wept when he saw her. She had been in Kazakhstan for 4 years. She was 55 years old. She had survived the interrogations and the camp, and the 4 years of separation from everything that had constituted her life, and she had not given them Molotov. And now she was in the apartment, and he was weeping, and what passed between them in that room is not in any historical record and should not be invented. They remained married until her death in 1970. Molotov outlived her. He outlived Stalin and Khrushchev and the entire political generation he had been part of, dying in 1986 at the age of 96, the last of the original Bolsheviks. He spent his final decades attempting to rehabilitate his Stalinist record, arguing that Stalin had been fundamentally correct, that the purges had been necessary, that the system had worked. He said these things in the interviews he gave to a Soviet journalist named Felix Chuev, which were published as a book called Molotov Remembers, and they are not the reflections of a man who had achieved clarity about what he had done. They are the reflections of a man who had decided at some point during the 96 years of his life that the only available alternative to believing in the thing he had served was an accounting he could not afford to make. He is buried in the Novodevichy cemetery in Moscow, beside Polina. The question of what the signing of that warrant means, of what it means that a man signed his wife's arrest warrant and wept when she returned and continued to defend the system that produced the warrant until his death, is not a question with a resolution. It is a question that the historical record poses and leaves open, because the historical record is the account of what people did, not of why the doing was possible, and the why in this case requires access to an interior that closed in 1986 and has not been available since. But Molotov is not the only man in this account who signed a document that sent his wife toward death. He is not even the most extreme case. The most extreme case is a man who did not vote to arrest his wife in a Politburo meeting. The most extreme case is a man who watched his wife be arrested, who was taken in by the same dragnet that took her, who survived the labor camps and was released and found his way back to the city where they had lived and discovered that she had not survived, and who spent the rest of his life writing about what he had witnessed, because writing was the only instrument he had left. His name was Osip Mandelstam. He was not a dictator. He was not a Politburo member. He was a poet. He matters to this account not because he signed a warrant, but because his wife, Nadezhda Mandelstam, wrote one of the most important documents about the Stalinist period ever produced, a memoir called Hope Against Hope, which is also the pun of her name, Nadezhda, meaning hope, in Russian. And because the story of their marriage and its destruction by the Soviet state is the counter-image of the Molotov story, the version of the same historical forces seen from the position of the people those forces were designed to consume. Osip Mandelstam was arrested for the first time in 1934 after writing and reciting to a small group of friends a poem about Stalin. The poem described Stalin's thick fingers, his cockroach whiskers, the boot-leather words, the executions he played with as toys. It was not a poem designed for survival. It was a poem that a man wrote because the thing he was describing had become impossible to contain within the available silence, and writing was the only form of resistance he possessed. Someone in the group informed. The informing was not unusual. The system had created a culture of informing so pervasive that the poet's circle of friends was always already a potential network of witnesses for the security apparatus, and Mandelstam had known this when he wrote the poem and read it aloud. He was arrested. Nadezhda was with him when they came. She was not arrested in that first instance. She was left in the apartment, which was itself a form of the system's specific cruelty, the leaving behind, the knowledge that the arrest would be followed by silence, and that the silence would be indefinite. Stalin made a phone call about the case. He called Boris Pasternak, the other great poet of the period, and asked him what he thought of Mandelstam, apparently genuinely curious about the literary assessment of the man whose poem had just been delivered to his desk. Pasternak navigated the call with the terrified caution of a man who understood that a wrong answer was more dangerous than an unclear one. Stalin asked, "Is Mandelstam a master?" Pasternak hedged. Stalin hung up. The first arrest produced exile rather than execution. Mandelstam and Nadezhda were sent to Voronezh, a city 300 miles south of Moscow, where they lived in poverty and surveillance and the specific limbo of people who have been punished but not destroyed, who exist at the margin of the system's tolerance in a state that could be resolved in either direction at any moment. Nadezhda worked to support them both. She took whatever teaching and translation work was available. She memorized Osip's poems, held them in her head, word for word, because paper could be seized, because the poems that existed only on paper could be destroyed, because the only safe archive was the one inside a person who could not be searched without killing her. She memorized everything. The second arrest came in 1938. The Voronezh exile had ended, and they had been living in a dacha outside Moscow in conditions of continued precariousness when the NKVD came again. This time, Nadezhda was also taken in for initial questioning before being released. Osip was taken fully. He died in a transit camp outside Vladivostok in December 1938, waiting for transfer to a labor camp further east. The exact circumstances of his death are not fully documented. He was 57 years old. He had written, in the labor camp period, a series of poems that Nadezhda had not been present to memorize, and those poems may or may not have survived in the accounts of other prisoners, and the uncertainty about what was preserved is itself part of what the system was designed to produce, not just the death of the poet, but the possible death of the poems. Nadezhda survived. She survived the war and the remainder of the Stalin period, and the Khrushchev thaw, and into the Brezhnev era, living in poverty, teaching English at provincial universities, moving to avoid becoming too visible, keeping inside her head the archive of poems she had memorized in Voronezh. When Stalin died, she began to write. Hope Against Hope was published abroad in 1970 and circulated in samizdat inside the Soviet Union, copied by hand, passed from reader to reader, a book that existed in defiance of the system that had killed the man it was about. It is one of the most precise and unsparing accounts of life under Stalinism ever produced. It does not perform grief. It does not sentimentalize. It describes, with a specificity, that the style of this script is designed to honor what the system did to the people inside it and how the people inside it participated in what was being done to them, because participation was the condition of survival, and survival was the condition of testimony. She wrote the second volume, Hope Abandoned, which extended the account and deepened it, and refused in both books to provide the reader with any comfort that the evidence did not support. She died in 1980. She is buried in Moscow. The contrast between Nadezhda Mandelstam and Polina Zhemchuzhina is the contrast the historical record provides when you place the two women beside each other. One a senior official, one a poet's wife. One arrested by a vote that included her husband's signature. One arrested because her husband wrote a poem. One protected by proximity to power even inside the labor camp. One protected by nothing except the specific courage of a woman who had decided that the poems would not be lost. Both of them Nadezhda, both of them Hope. There is a third case. It is the case that the other two cases exist in the shadow of, because it is the case of the man who created the system, who created the Politburo votes and the labor camps and the informer networks, and the specific culture of compliance that made it possible for a man to sign his wife's arrest warrant without visible hesitation. The man who lost his own wife to a bullet she fired herself in an apartment in the Kremlin on the night after a party where he had been publicly cruel to her. Stalin's relationship with Nadezhda's memory is the strangest thing in this account and the most revealing. He kept her photographs. This is documented in the personal effects found after his death in the dacha at Kuntsevo, where he died on the floor in March 1953. There were photographs of Nadezhda Alliluyeva. He had kept them for 20 years after her death. He had kept them through the purges and the war and the late Stalinist terror and the doctor's plot and the final paranoid years when he was signing execution lists with the same hand he used to turn the pages of the books he read in the night. He kept her photographs and he never spoke of her publicly, and he never, as far as the historical record shows, acknowledged to anyone what she had said to him in the letter she left or what he thought about the fact that she had said it. He converted the grief, if it was grief, if the response of a man like Stalin to the death of his wife can be mapped onto that word without distorting both the word and the man into policy. The purges that followed, the terror that consumed the party and the military and the intelligentsia in the years after 1934 cannot be explained as the direct consequence of Nadezhda's death. The causes of the terror are multiple and structural and political and extend well beyond the bedroom of one man. But the timing is part of the record, and the escalation that begins in 1934 and reaches its peak in 1937 and 1938 is the period immediately following the loss of the one person who had told him, directly and in person, that what he was doing was wrong. He could not tolerate the statement. He could not answer it. He could not sit with the person who had made it. He could not make the accounting she was asking him to make. He made a different accounting. He made it at scale, across the country, over years, with lists and firing squads and labor camps and the specific bureaucratic architecture of a man who has decided that the problem is not his actions, but the people who are troubled by them. He kept her photographs. This is not a contradiction. This is the full texture of what the historical record actually contains, not the clean story of a monster who felt nothing, but the more disturbing story of a man who felt something, who had felt something, who had chosen repeatedly and systematically and with enormous institutional force to convert the feeling into its political opposite, and to do this so completely and for so long that the photographs in the desk drawer and the millions of deaths in the labor camps existed simultaneously in the same man, in the same life. And he died on the floor of his dacha in March 1953, and the photographs were found and the dead were not brought back. What does it mean to sign your wife's death warrant? It means different things in each of these cases, and the differences are the argument. In Molotov's case, it is a vote cast in a room, in the specific political atmosphere of the late Stalin period, by a man who understood that his own survival depended on his compliance, and who had been in the system long enough that the compliance had become structural, not a choice made freshly each time, but a set of conditioned responses that the system had installed over 30 years, so that the vote was not experienced as a choice but as the next step in a procedure that had its own momentum. In Stalin's case, it is more diffuse and more total. He did not sign a warrant for Nadezhda. He created the conditions under which Nadezhda could not survive, not by a specific act but by the accumulation of acts, the specific person he had become by the night of November 7th, 1932. The specific cruelties of a man who had been performing absolute authority for so long that the performance had abolished the interior space in which ordinary human accountability might have operated. She did not die because of a document. She died because the man she had married had become something that the life they were living together could not contain. And Osip Mandelstam, who is in this account not as the signer of a warrant, but as the signed upon, the man whose wife survived him and wrote the most complete testimony the period produced, is here to demonstrate what the system looked like from the position of the consumed, because the system cannot be understood only from the position of the men who ran it. It has to be understood from the position of the people it processed, the poets in the labor camps, the women who memorized the poems so they would not be lost, the specific courage of a person who decides that testimony is what survival is for. The three couples are the three positions available inside the Stalinist system, as this account has arranged them: the ruler, who loses his wife to the system he has built before the system was fully operational, and who responds by building it larger and more lethal, and who keeps her photographs in a desk drawer for 20 years. The official, who serves the ruler and signs the paperwork for his wife's arrest and weeps when she comes back and defends the system until he dies at 96, having decided that the accounting was too expensive to make. The poet, who writes the poem anyway, knowing what it will cost, and whose wife memorizes everything and outlives everyone, and writes the books that the system tried to prevent, because the system understood that testimony was the one thing it could not fully control, that a woman with poems in her head was a form of archive that the NKVD did not have a procedure for. These are the options the system provided: the ruler, the official, the poet, and the women who outlasted all of them: Nadezhda, whose death produced the silence in the desk drawer and the photographs kept for 20 years; Polina, who did not give them Molotov and who came back to the apartment and about whom we know that he wept; and Nadezhda, the other Nadezhda, who memorized the poems and wrote the books and died in 1980 with the archive intact. 3 women, 3 Nadezhda, hope, 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 none of it restored, all of it preserved. The Novodevichy Cemetery in Moscow contains the graves of Molotov and Polina side by side, which is the final statement of that relationship and of what they were to each other, and of what the signing of the warrant and the weeping at the return actually meant in the long accounting of a marriage that survived things that marriages are not designed to survive. The graves are there. The names are on them. People visit. Stalin is in the Kremlin wall, which is not the same as a grave in any ordinary sense. It is a state burial, a political location, the wall of the institution he built and ran for 30 years. The photographs of Nadezhda Alliluyeva are not in the Kremlin wall. They are wherever the personal effects of dead men go when the men are gone, and the states they built have become something different. Osip Mandelstam's grave does not exist. His body was in a transit camp, and then it was not. And the transit camp was cleared and the land was repurposed. And the exact location of the remains of the man who wrote the poem about Stalin's cockroach whiskers is not known. His poems exist. Nadezhda's books exist. The poem itself exists, preserved in the memory of the woman who memorized everything and decided that the memorizing was what she was for. The warrant that Molotov signed exists in the Russian State Archive. Scholars have seen it. His signature is on it. It is a piece of paper with a name on it and a signature below the name, and the name is his wife's and the signature is his. And the paper authorized her arrest and her transport to Kazakhstan and the 4 years that followed. He signed it. He wept when she came back. Both of these things are true. They are both in the record. They exist in the record together, without resolution, without the narrative mechanism that would convert them into a lesson or a verdict or a conclusion that the audience can carry out of the room and set down somewhere and not think about again. History does not provide that mechanism. It provides the record. The record contains a vote, a signature, a labor camp, a return, a man weeping, a grave in Novodevichy Cemetery, the name Polina on the stone, and in the same record, 50 years earlier, a party in the Kremlin, a woman who left it, an apartment, a letter, a small pistol, a mourning, and in the same record, a transit camp outside Vladivostok in December 1938, and a woman in Moscow holding poems in her head, waiting. The record does not tell you what to make of it. The record tells you what happened. What you make of it is yours, and it will cost you something to make it, and the cost is the minimum requirement of taking the record seriously. The warrant was signed. This is what was signed. This is what the signing cost. This is where the cost was paid, and by whom, and whether the payment was sufficient, is not a question the historical record answers, because sufficient is not a category that the historical record uses. It uses occurred. It uses documented. It uses this is what happened, and this is who was there, and this is what they did, and this is what remained. What remained is this, the signature on the paper, the weeping in the apartment, the poems in the woman's head, the photographs in the desk drawer, and the dead, who are the largest category in the record, and the most silent, and who are owed the one thing that this and every account of this period can only partially provide, the true measure. The true measure, which requires a scale that no account possesses and no verdict delivers, and which the record approaches imperfectly, word by word, fact by fact, name by name, in the specific hope that accumulation is a form of justice, even when it is the only form available. It is the only form available. It has to be enough.